The excavator engines went quiet at exactly 4:12 in the afternoon, and for a long moment nobody on the crew said a word. Cole Whitman stood at the edge of a pit that geologists were now calling one of the richest deep zones ever mapped on his family's Alaska claim. A zone that early estimates put somewhere near $200 million in recoverable gold. And instead of pushing his machines harder, he raised his hand and gave the order to stop. Just stop. On paper, this was the moment every miner dreams about, the jackpot vein after years of scraping by on thin pay streaks. But underground, something didn't feel right, and Cole knew that the difference between the biggest score of his career and the worst disaster of his life might come down to a decision made in the next 60 seconds. So why would a miner, sitting on a fortune, order his own crew to walk away from it? That's the story we're digging into today, and if you're new here, stick around, because this one gets stranger the deeper it goes. Cole Whitman didn't inherit an easy claim. The ground he worked in the interior of Alaska had been passed down through 2 generations of prospectors who scratched out modest seasons and never once struck anything close to a real bonanza. When Cole took over full control of the operation 3 years ago, most of the old-timers around him figured he'd run it the same cautious way his father had, pulling a few thousand ounces a season and calling it a living. But Cole had spent his winters studying geological survey data most miners never bother to read, cross-referencing old placer records with satellite terrain imaging, looking for something the previous generation might have missed. He became convinced that the surface gold his family had mined for decades was only the leftover trace of something much bigger sitting deeper underground, an ancient buried channel that modern equipment could finally reach. Convincing his crew was another matter. Deep drilling costs real money, and Cole's foreman, a weathered miner named Russ Delaney who'd worked the ground since Cole was in diapers, thought the whole idea sounded like a young man's fantasy. Still, Cole scraped together enough of the season's budget to bring in a drill rig and put down more than 24 exploratory holes across nearly 300 acres of frozen ground. The first several holes came back exactly the way Russ expected. Light traces here and there, nothing worth getting excited about. Cole kept drilling anyway, moving the rig in a grid pattern across the claim, refusing to let one disappointing hole talk him out of the theory he'd built over an entire winter of research. Then hole after hole started telling the same story. At depths between roughly 80 and 110 feet, core samples began showing consistent gold signals, not just in one isolated spot, but across multiple locations spread over a wide stretch of the claim. For Cole, that repetition was the detail that changed everything. A single rich sample could be luck, a fluke pocket that any prospector might stumble across once in a career. But when the same gold-bearing layer kept showing up at nearly identical depths in hole after hole, it stopped looking like luck and started looking like a pattern. And patterns in geology usually mean something is connected underground in ways the surface never revealed. Cole sent the most promising samples out for laboratory analysis, unwilling to bet the season on visual inspection alone. While he waited on results, he brought in an independent geologist to help build out a subsurface model using all the drill data collected so far. What came back reshaped how Cole understood his own family's ground. The geologist's working theory was that the gold wasn't sitting in isolated pockets at all, but had been deposited millions of years earlier by an ancient river channel that had long since dried up and been buried under successive layers of soil, gravel, and glacial till. If that theory held, the surface gold his family had chased for decades was nothing more than a faint echo of a much larger deposit sitting far below, undisturbed for longer than anyone could really comprehend. The lab results came back a week later and confirmed what the drilling had already suggested. Multiple samples pulled from that 80 to 110-foot layer carried gold concentrations well above anything found near the surface. Combining the assay data with the geological model, Cole's team put together an early estimate suggesting the buried channel could hold somewhere in the range of 60 to 90,000 recoverable ounces. At current gold prices, that translated to a potential gross value climbing toward $200 million, an almost unthinkable number for a claim that had spent decades producing a modest, steady trickle of gold and nothing more. Cole didn't celebrate. He'd been around mining long enough to know that a number on a spreadsheet and gold sitting safely in a cleanup barrel are two very different things. Total gold in the ground and gold you can actually safely extract are rarely close to the same figure. Some of that deposit might sit beneath unstable ground. Some of it might require equipment the operation didn't own. And every foot of overburden that had to be stripped away to reach the pay layer added cost, time, and risk that a gross value estimate never accounts for. Still, the potential was enough to justify moving forward, and Cole made the call to begin excavation toward the deep zone the following week. The first days of digging went smoothly. Excavators pulled back layer after layer of frozen overburden, and the wash plant started processing material pulled from progressively deeper cuts. Early cleanups showed promising color, nothing spectacular yet, but enough to keep the crew's confidence high as they pushed toward the target depth. Russ Delaney, who'd been skeptical from the start, admitted the ground was behaving better than he expected. For a few days, it looked like Cole's gamble on his own research was about to pay off in a way nobody on that crew had ever witnessed firsthand. Then the ground started talking back. As the pit crept closer to the 80-foot mark, a section of the pit wall on the eastern side began showing hairline cracking that hadn't been there the day before. It wasn't dramatic, nothing that would have caught the eye of anyone not specifically watching for it, but Cole's site engineer flagged it immediately during a routine walkthrough. At the same time, a water seep appeared near the base of a nearby test cut, slow at first, but steady, the kind of seep that experienced miners know can either be nothing or an early warning sign of a much larger problem building underground. Cole called a halt to excavation that same afternoon, well short of the depth where the richest samples had been found. He knew exactly what was sitting below that ground, a fortune large enough to change his family's operation forever. And he also knew that pushing forward without answering the questions the cracking and the seep had raised could put his entire crew in danger. Deep placer ground in Alaska carries real risk once water pressure and weak soil layers get involved, and a wall failure at that depth isn't something equipment can simply dig its way out of. It can bury machinery, trap crew members, and end a season and possibly a life in the space of a few seconds. That night, Cole sat down with Russ and the site engineer to weigh their options. On one side of the table was a deposit worth close to $200 million, sitting only a few dozen feet below where they'd already dug. On the other side was mounting evidence that the ground around that deposit wasn't behaving the way stable ground should. Russ, the same man who doubted Cole's theory from the beginning, was now the one arguing hardest for caution, telling Cole flatly that no number on a spreadsheet was worth risking a collapse. Cole didn't need much convincing. He'd built his entire case for this dig on patient, careful analysis, and he wasn't about to abandon that discipline the moment the payoff got real. The following morning, Cole made the announcement that stunned everyone watching the operation from outside. He was shutting the deep cut down entirely until an independent geotechnical team could assess the stability of the ground and design a safer route to the pay layer. Machines that had spent days chewing toward a fortune sat idle. Trucks that had been hauling pay dirt around the clock went quiet. For a claim that had just confirmed one of the richest deposits in its history, the sudden silence felt almost surreal, and plenty of people close to the operation quietly wondered whether Cole was walking away from the discovery of a lifetime out of an abundance of caution that might not have been necessary. Cole saw it differently. He'd spent an entire winter building a case for gold that nobody else believed was there. And that same patience was exactly what told him not to rush the next step. Bringing in outside engineers meant delay, and delay meant cost, but it also meant the difference between reaching that deposit safely and risking everything on ground that hadn't been fully understood. Over the following 2 weeks, geotechnical specialists ran their own stability tests across the pit, mapping soil composition, groundwater behavior, and the structural integrity of the surrounding walls. Cole authorized additional shallow drilling around the perimeter of the target zone to give the engineers a clearer picture of what they were dealing with before anyone went back in with heavy equipment. The results, when they finally came back, offered a mix of good and difficult news. The gold-bearing layer was real, consistent, and just as rich as the earlier sample suggested, confirming that Cole's original theory about the buried channel had been right all along. But the engineers also confirmed that the eastern approach the crew had originally been digging was sitting too close to a natural fault in the soil structure, a weak seam that widened dramatically the closer excavation got to the pay layer. Continuing on that same path, they concluded, would have significantly raised the odds of a wall failure once the pit reached full depth. Their recommendation was to open a new approach from the western side of the claim, cutting a wider, more gradual slope that would require moving substantially more overburden, but would keep the crew working on stable ground the entire way down. For Cole, the choice was straightforward, even though it wasn't cheap. The new approach meant weeks of additional excavation before the crew ever touched pay dirt again, along with the cost of extra fuel, extra equipment hours, and a revised water management plan to keep the new cut from flooding as it deepened. It also meant the season's mining calendar would need to be reworked entirely, pushing back other planned cuts across the claim to free up the crew and machinery this new approach demanded. But it meant nobody had to risk standing beneath ground that engineers had already flagged as unstable, and for Cole, that trade-off wasn't close. Word of the shutdown and the reasoning behind it spread through the small community of Alaska prospectors faster than Cole expected. Some miners praised the decision, calling it exactly the kind of restraint the industry needs more of, especially with placer mining accidents making headlines almost every season somewhere in the north. Others weren't so sure, arguing that Cole had already proven the gold was there and should have found a faster way to reach it before another operation staked out a similar theory on ground nearby. Cole mostly stayed out of the debate. He'd made his decision based on what his engineers told him, not on what would look most impressive to people watching from a distance, and he wasn't interested in defending that choice to anyone who hadn't walked the pit themselves. 3 weeks after the original shutdown, machinery finally rolled back onto the claim, this time cutting into the western slope engineers had approved. Progress was slower than the original path would have been, careful and methodical in a way that tested the patience of a crew eager to finally reach the layer they now knew was sitting there waiting. Cole kept a close eye on every foot of new excavation, watching for any sign of the same instability that had shut the operation down the first time. Weeks passed without incident, the new slope holding firm exactly the way the geotechnical team had predicted it would. When the excavators finally broke through into the target depth, the first loads pulled from the new cut came back showing gold concentrations that matched and in a few spots exceeded the numbers from the original core samples. For Cole, that moment carried a different kind of weight than the initial discovery had. The first time around, everything had been theory, a promising number on a lab report that still had to survive contact with reality. This time, gold was moving through the wash plant in real quantities, confirming that the patience of the past several weeks had been worth every delay it cost. Whether the claim ultimately produces the full 60 to 90,000 ounces the early estimate suggested is still something only time and continued excavation will answer. Recoverable totals in placer mining rarely match early projections exactly, and Cole knows better than most that the number on a geological report and the number that ends up in a cleanup barrel by the end of the season can tell very different stories. But what's already clear is that a claim once dismissed as a modest, steady producer turned out to be sitting on something far larger than anyone in Cole's family had ever imagined, and that the decision to stop, reassess, and go back in a safer way likely saved this operation from a disaster that no amount of gold would have made worth it. For Cole Whitman, the lesson of this season wasn't really about the size of the deposit at all. It was about the discipline to walk away from a fortune the moment the ground stopped cooperating, and the patience to come back and do it right rather than chase the payout on a timeline the Earth itself hadn't agreed to. That's a harder story to tell than a simple jackpot discovery. But out here in Alaska, it might be the difference between a miner who gets lucky once and one who's still standing at the end of a long career. If you want to see how the rest of this season plays out as more of that deep gold comes up through the wash plant, make sure you're subscribed, because this claim is only just getting started.